The first entry in James Gunn's DCU just finished. So was it any good? Creature Commandos, an animated project featuring a bunch of weirdos. This was something that seemed right up Gunn's alley, and that continued his trend of taking a random group of nobodies and misfits and threw them together into a team. Above all, he would then make you care about them by giving them tragic backstories or something. He did it with Guardians of the Galaxy, the Suicide Squad, even Peacemaker. And now this. It was perhaps the most surprising announcement from the initial DCU slate reveal, given that it was the first project announced before any other major hero. From the first look shown, there have been some slight changes, notably Dr. Phosphorus going from orange to green, and Rick Flag's hair. Flag's hair was changed a bit because Frank Grillo had to film Tulsa King, so there's that, and Phosphorus was presumably changed because green is more obviously conveying radiation than orange. The orange does look really cool though, and I would have liked to see it, but I get why. This is part review, part just me talking about the show as a whole. It's already been renewed for a second season as well. If you've been watching, what are your thoughts on the show? Let me know in the comments down below. So let's start with the good, which is continuing what Gunn does well. Making tangible and surprisingly emotional backstories for every single character. He loves to make his characters seem like the biggest one-note jokes, but then he tears it all down with the most tragic story ever. From the beginning, Gunn said that the bride was essentially going to be the main character of the show. And she is, given that Rick Flag is in a coma for an episode. She has by far the most screen time out of any character. Her character is kinda weird at times. The origin stuff is sticking with the whole creature wants a bride who will love him, so he goes to Frankenstein. But they twisted it here to be the bride and Frankenstein getting together, which has a lot of strange implications, but also fitting given who Frankenstein is. She's also the only one who ends up having an actual character arc. Everyone else, we just learn about their backstory, but they do not actually grow. For the handful of episodes G.I. Robot was in, he was a lot of fun. He's a good type of one note in that he has his one intention and joy in life, and the payoff is brilliant. Gunn constantly just teasing that the robot can be a great killing machine, and when we finally get to see him unleash the carnage that he had been waiting for decades to dish out,
oh boy, Nazis.
It's just glorious. It's getting the chance to see a robot built to kill, have joy. Who expected Weasel's backstory to be the most emotionally intense one in a superhero show? Freaking Weasel. The guy best remembered for licking the glass on a door and then drowning. A character completely intended to just be a throwaway joke guy until now. A character joke to have
killed 27 children, but you know, we got him to, I think he's agreed to do this.
There were just a half dozen or so who he was simply trying to play with and then save. I am curious if they choose to expand on the character though, because they haven't given any explanation on whether he's really human or just an evolved animal. Because he obviously has emotions and intelligence, but chooses to hide it, so maybe season 2 will do more. The Dr. Phosphorus sequence was one of the most fun things in a superhero show or movie in a while. Thank you James Gunn, thank you Matt Reeves, for recently giving us goofy themed henchmen again. Like yes, we need supervillains having coordinated dances with their goons. It was pretty surprising how even in animation that Phosphorus in his human form was still clearly Alan Tudyk. They did a good job of also showing the dueling contrast between Phosphorus and his human self. In his takeover of the Gotham underworld, he still has his wife on his mind. She and his family were what truly matters to him, even though he was doing goofy dances. And there's a reason that Gunn keeps making jokes about Phosphorus smiling, because he always looks like he is, but he's really feeling as terrible as someone can be.
You smiling?
Yes.
Sarcastically?
It was this in the Weasel episode that did the best at humanizing their creatures, showing both sides of the coin and how there is still a lot of man underneath the flaming skeleton and weird animal. Nina served as a good foil to the bride and the team as a whole, representing some sense of sanity within the group. She's the one that's most easiest for the audience to connect with, and so of course, Gunn chooses to kill her off, which is the point of her being the nice one, but it is what it is. Frankenstein is interesting. Voiced by David Harbour, who gives a voice I would not have expected Frankenstein to have. He's been labeled Frankenself for a good reason, because that's really his character. A loser way too obsessed with the bride who needs to learn how to actually move on. There are elements of his eloquence from the original novel that sometimes gets broken out, and then he will also follow it up with one of the dumbest line reads. So his character is really a paradox in that he shows great depth and then loses it all in the next scene. At the very least, he is still good as a brutish figure and fights like one too. The team leader, Rick Flag himself, is fine. He's just a generic army guy though, which is really what any Rick Flag is for the most part. But even after all this, all these emotional backstories and stuff, I found myself really struggling to care about any of it. Even when considering it as its own thing, it just felt like a side mission to something greater. It feels small but too large at the same time. I was very mixed on the humor. Gunn humor I think has its moments. The Suicide Squad and Guardians were mostly funny, but this leans into the worst aspects of his humor a lot. They don't hit very hard, and while a lot of the visual gags are fun for sure, a lot of the spoken stuff just takes too long to really reach an interesting punchline. Overall, the voice acting was good, given that it's a mix of voice actors and on-screen actors. The worst of the bunch was Grillo as Flag, but once again, Flag is kind of a generic army guy, and Grillo is convincing enough as that. Although I will say that Viola Davis sounds really bored as Amanda Waller. The show is animated by the studio that does the really good-looking Invincible teasers, and it looks good. There's definitely a lot of color, which works in most cases, but does make things more annoying to follow at times. Action is fine, some cool moments here and there, but not a singular fight scene that wows me. In movies, I don't think structure and pacing is that big of a deal, but in shows it's very important just to make it feel like a show and have an episodic nature. Here it has some interesting effects, because every single episode features an origin or flashback nature. This automatically takes up a significant portion of the episode, and then only leaves so much time to develop the present day story. And that present day story, the fictional country Pakistan and its princess Ilana, that's a very classic Gunn deep cut. A country with a grand total of 10 appearances. And at first Cersei was being angled to be the big bad of the show, but was quickly dispatched in the first few episodes. Power Scalers, some of the worst people to interact with, but Cersei getting taken down by Weasel and Phosphorus was kind of lame, given that she's probably going to fight and defeat, or at least make it really hard for Wonder Woman. I also just ended up forgetting that she was in the show, because of just how fast everything moves. After they defeat Cersei, they meander at Bel Rev for a bit, before end up going back and attempting to assassinate the princess. It's trying to be two shows at once, with one being far superior to the other. Also, the way they portray Pakistan military is strange, I guess. You've got some of the oldest looking tanks out there in full combat, but also these sci-fi guys in Iron Man armor with lasers. Alexei was a fun character for all that he lasted. One of those dumb one-note joke characters that worked until he got his face blown to smithereens. The thing is, there just isn't a whole lot of time for these characters to really get to know each other. The Bride and Nina spend the most time together, G.I. Robot dies pretty quick, and then Phosphorus and the Weasel are loners. Flag is also gone for half of the episodes and trying to do some messed up buddy cop routine with Frankenstein. The found family aspect that Gunn is so good at is very much missing from the show. There's flashes, sure, but it's not the strong emotional core that Gunn has consistently delivered in the past. Even Peacemaker did it, and I don't know if it's a time thing because it's animated or what, but it would have been nice to have, to make me really care for these characters and be sad when they struggle or hyped when they succeed. But maybe that's intentional, because Phosphorus does ask if it seemed like he cared in the finale, when they were trying to encourage Nina. And besides the Bride and Nina, none of them seem to have found any sort of interesting or deep camaraderie. Alright, comics. You guys like comic stuff too, right? Well, this is a very different take from the one from the comics, which was a World War II set book about a normal guy taking what were essentially Universal's monsters on covert missions. It was a very on-the-nose book in that the message was that sometimes humans can be cruel monsters and the scary monsters kind, which is a good route to take, but man, it was blunt. Different from the Commandos, but also the same in that it held the Suicide Squad framework of picking the country's most undesirables, strapping some bombs in them, and sending them to do dirty work. But is this really the bang that the DCU needed? Creature Commandos, it's good, but it's not great. It's a show in its own unique corner of the DCU, but one that also heavily teases and plays with major aspects of the DCU. Now, of course, it should be graded on its own standings, but it was also chosen to be the first DCU entry for a reason. Most likely because it was being made for the old DCEU and just got shoved in, since it was mostly done. Gunn has been emphatic in calling Superman the true birth of the DCU. Because, well, having the first project be an R-rated animated show about a bunch of nobodies is simply not the ideal way to launch what is hoped to be one of the biggest franchises ever. But there's a lot of cameo gore. The Cersei vision, of course, holds the most, where we see the Trinity, Wally West, Blue Beetle, Starfire, Supergirl, Peacemaker, Grodd, and some more. Then there's the Batman appearance in the Phosphorus episode, the fact that Cersei and Themyscira are heavily mentioned, and then Clayface is in there, who's getting his own solo film. It feels distracting at times, and most of the discussion around the show seems to stem from these quick appearances, which is a shame. because there's a lot more that can and should be discussed, even if it's not a show as good as some of Gunn's previous works. But disregarding all of that, Creature Commandos is another hit for Gunn. Just one that is not nearly as impactful as any of his previous works. It also represents part of the greater return to form for DC animation, alongside shows like My Adventures with Superman and Batman Caped Crusader, neither of which have been the greatest stories ever told or anything, but were still positively received and good enough. It's also important that DC shows that they can still do R-rated animation right, given how the Harley Quinn show fell off, and nobody watched the Kite Man one. This is perhaps not the smash hit that you would want, but over time, with more seasons, with more episodes or runtime, this could develop into something really interesting.